The village of Everwinter Mary lay folded in the hush of December like a snow-dusted water-colour. It was the sort of English settlement that seemed suspended outside of time. Honey, stoned cottages, smoke, curled chimneys, frost-webbed hedgerows, and the constant whisper of the river fallow that glided behind the vicarage orchard and beneath the old footbridge by the mill. Christmas preparations were well under way. Garlands looped across lantern-posts. Shop windows glowed with sugared scenes of plum puddings and paper angels. The bells of St. Mary's Church, recently polished and gleaming, practised their hymnal peals each afternoon, their chimes echoing far across the fields where sheep clustered in woolly clouds near the woods. Even the air carried festive ceremony spiced with holly, coal smoke, and the faint sweetness of roasted chestnuts drifting from the village square. Despite its name, Everwinter did not always guarantee snow, yet when it arrived, it did so faithfully and thickly, like a seasonal oath. And this year was no exception. Snow blanketed the rooftops, collected in gentle mounds upon window ledges, and softened the edges of every lane until the entire village resembled a world crafted by mittened hands. It was into this picturesque calm that Mrs. Augusta Hawthorne, the village's keenest observer of human nature, conducted her daily routines with measured grace. A silver-haired lady of 70, too, she was small in stature but considerable in presence, with sharp grey eyes that missed nothing, and a deceptively mild expression that encouraged people to say more than they intended. She lived in a snug cottage named Thimble End, a place filled with mismatched teacups, knitted throws, and well-thumbed notebooks, where she recorded everything from plant rot remedies to observations about the curious behaviours of neighbours. Mrs. Hawthorne had never considered herself a detective. Precisely, she merely possessed what her late husband once called a talent for noticing the obvious before anyone else realizes it is important. Colonel Hawthorne, a disciplined man, had found it both exasperating and impressive that his wife could unravel the emotional politics of a village tea-table faster than most officers could decipher battlefield maps. She was stirring her morning tiosom, brewed for exactly 3 minutes, with a dash of milk added after the infusion when the first knock arrived. It was Mr. Tibbins, the postman, stamping snow from his boots on the mat. "Begging your pardon, Mrs. Hawthorne," he said, removing his cap, his nose pink with cold, "but there's a bit of a stir already, and the day's hardly begun. Thought you'd like to hear it before the gossip turns monstrous. Gossip always does, when left unattended." She replied, offering him a cup, which he accepted gratefully. "Now then, what calamity has befallen us so early in the season?" "Well," said Mr. Tibbins, lowering his voice though no one else was present, "it's Sable Manor. The Sable family's Christmas gathering started last night. Guests arrived, roaring fire lit, carols singing, the whole spectacle. But just before dawn, the housemaid swears she heard tapping inside the old hearth. Not the fire inside the bricks. Then, moments later, the family solicitor, Mr. Gideon Pike, was found collapsed in the drawing-room, quite dead apparently. The doctor's there now." Mrs. Hawthorne paused, spoon hovering mid-air. "Collapsed near the fireplace. No, drawing-room sofa. But the maid insists the sound came from the hearth in the Christmas drawing-room. Calls it a ghostly warning. Silly talk, if you ask me, but you know how these grand houses breed legends." "Oh, legends are rarely born without a seed of truth," she murmured, gaze distant now, thoughtful. "Even silly talk deserves careful listening, especially at Christmas." Sable Manor stood a mile beyond the village boundary, framed by tall firs and guarded by iron gates shaped like twisting vines. The estate was stately but sombre elegant stonework, darkened by decades of winter rains, turreted roofs, and windows that reflected candlelight like stars trapped behind glass. The manor carried a long history, most of it impressive, some of it peculiar, and one particular legend that had lingered like wood smoke in every retelling, the legend of the Whispering Hearth. It was said that the great fireplace in the Christmas drawing-room had been built over the sealed entrance of a priest-hole used during the war years. The original cavity had long been bricked up, yet old villagers still claimed that on certain winter nights the manor fire whispered, not in words exactly, but in warning, like crackles that behaved too deliberately to be random. One elderly villager once claimed it sounded like tapping for attention, as though someone wished to be heard. Most dismissed it as atmospheric fancy. Others, particularly those who had worked in the house, claimed they would never sit too close to the hearth after midnight. The current occupants of the manor were Sir Edmund Sable, dignified, silver-templed, the last patriarch of a once formidable family, now more attached to tradition than authority. Lady Helena Sable, gracious, meticulous, the orchestrator of every Christmas detail from ribbon placement to guest seating. Miss Opaline Sable, their niece, intelligent, composed, recently returned from London, harbouring ambitions larger than village life. Mrs. Drusilla Caraway, Lady Helena's sister, a sharp, tongued woman with an appetite for propriety and control. Major Cyril Fenwick, Opaline's cousin, recovering from wartime injury, fond of whisky and nostalgia. Mr. Jasper Quill, a distant Sable relative, a collector of antiquities, enthusiastic, eccentric, and given to long monologues about curious artifacts. Mrs. Beatrice Slade the Long, serving housekeeper, loyal, impenetrable, and observant in her own right. And now newly deceased, Mr. Gideon Pike, family solicitor, precise in dress and language, keeper of sensitive documents, and the man who had arrived with a locked leather folio that never left his sight. Arrival at the manor by mid-morning, Mrs. Hawthorne was walking the snow-carpeted lane towards Sable Manor, accompanied by her guard, daughter Miss June Birch, a school-teacher who possessed a practical mind but a soft spot for mysteries. June carried a small tin of shortbread, which she claimed was for emergency diplomacy. "Do you really think it was the fireplace?" June asked as they approached the gates. "I think it was nearer the truth than the drawing-room sofa would suggest, Mrs." Hawthorne replied, "People collapse for reasons. Legends merely point us toward where to look." The gates stood ajar, footprints leading inward like evidence already written upon the snow. They passed beneath the portico, where wreaths drooped under white weight, their red berries peaking like punctuation marks against winter. Inside, the manor was warm, pine-scented, and glittering with carefully arranged holiday splendour, yet beneath it thrummed the tense quiet of a household bracing itself. Servants moved too softly, conversations ended too quickly, and the great Christmas fireplace burned bright and unremarkable, too unremarkable, perhaps, for something supposedly haunted. The hearth was colossal, framed in carved oak, depicting ivy, stags, and angels holding musical instruments. Stockings hung from brass hooks. Above it sat a mirror that reflected flames in endless duplication, as though the fire had 100 golden eyes. Lady Helena herself greeted them composed but pale, dressed in a deep green gown with a holly brooch pinned precisely at the collar. "Mrs. Hawthorne," she said, extending a hand cool as porcelain, "a dreadful business. Dr. Rowan believes it was the heart. though naturally there will be formalities. And Mr. Pike was well last evening, Mrs. Hawthorne asked gently. Perfectly well, in excellent spirits even. He toasted the season by the fire before retiring. And the folio, June interjected, unable to restrain herself, the leather one. Lady Helena blinked. He carried it in himself, said it contained finalized documents. He placed it beside him during carols. After that I cannot say. Mrs. Hawthorne's eyes drifted back to the fire, where logs crackled in rhythmic bursts. Entirely ordinary bursts, anyone would say. Yet she watched long enough that June noticed. "What are you thinking?" June whispered. "That when a fire speaks too plainly," she replied, "one must consider who benefits from no one listening at all." The inciting incident unfolds. The family gathered in the drawing-room soon after, where the village doctor, Dr. Rowan, confirmed the death publicly. He was a courteous man in his late 50s, solemn, with pince-nez spectacles that constantly threatened to slip down his nose. "Sir Edmund, Lady Helena," he said, addressing the assembled household, "I regret to confirm that Mr. Pike passed peacefully sometime after midnight. Preliminary assessment suggests natural causes. However, given the unexpected nature of his collapse, a report will be filed." Major Fenwick exhaled audibly. Opaline remained unreadable. Drusilla Carroway's lips thinned with restrained commentary. Jasper Quill looked faintly disappointed, as though natural deaths interfered with narrative potential. The housekeeper, Mrs. Slade, merely inclined her head respectful, but unshaken. Natural causes, they said. Peacefully, they said. Yet Everwinter was a place where peaceful conclusions were seldom reached without scrutiny. And Mrs. Hawthorne, seated now near the legendary fireplace, with a teacup warming her gloved fingers, felt the first unmistakable flicker of curiosity sharpen into purpose. A Christmas death, a warning legend. A man who guarded a folio, and a household full of people who knew more than they were saying. Christmas, she reflected, was a season of generosity, but also of secrets wrapped prettily and placed in plain sight. And somewhere within Sable Manor a murderer may have done exactly that. Sable Manor in daylight possessed an air of orchestrated splendour, yet once the shock of Mr. Pike's passing had been formally acknowledged. Its corridors seemed to narrow, its shadows deepen, and its silences acquire opinion. Snow pressed softly against the window-panes, but inside the house the atmosphere was no longer hushed by winter, it was waiting. Mrs. Augusta Hawthorne was well acquainted with waiting. In her experience, people revealed themselves not in declarations, but in pauses, the fraction of time before answering a question. The flicker of the eye toward the thing they wished had gone unnoticed, the breath taken before a name was spoken. She had been invited somewhat hastily to remain at the Manor for luncheon, a suggestion made by June Birch and accepted by Lady Helena with polite alacrity. No one wished to appear discourteous to a guest, particularly one who had already been half acknowledged as the village's unofficial problem solver. The luncheon table was a study in Christmas formality. Lady Helena had selected a winter white cloth embroidered with silver thread, matched with holly, brig napkin rings, and a centrepiece of frosted pine cones and scarlet berries. Soup was served a smooth chestnut bisque, with a swirl of cream followed by roast turkey, accompanied by bread sauce, buttered parsnips, and Brussels sprouts glazed with chestnut honey. It was hearty, fragrant, and impeccably timed. Yet, for all the warmth of the meal, conversation remained chilled. Drusilla Carroway wielded her spoon like a sceptre. "I still cannot imagine the excitement," she remarked, her voice clipped. A folio of documents, a tapping fireplace, and suddenly everyone is indulging a Gothic melodrama. One expects such notions from impressionable maids, not grown adults. A Major Cyril Fenwick, seated opposite her, dabbed his mouth with deliberation. "Legends can unsettle the nerves," he said, tone lighter than his eyes, "particularly old ones, and Christmas is precisely the season for spirits, figurative or otherwise. Spirits ought to remain in their bottles," Drusilla replied tartly. Jasper Quill brightened at the cue, as though someone had struck a match inside him. "Ah, but if you'll forgive me, Aunt Drusilla, folklore is a form of cultural archaeology. The Whispering Hearth, for example, it dates at least a century. I once acquired an 198 Christmas pamphlet referencing the very same rumour. Fascinating ephemera, that. I keep it in my study, naturally. Boxed, catalogued, and cross-referenced. Boxed and catalogued like everything else you own," murmured Major Fenwick into his glass. Opaline Sable said nothing at first. When she finally spoke, it was with a careful smoothness. "Whether or not the hearth whispers, we can agree the house has a talent for theatrics, though," she added, gaze sliding to Mrs. Hawthorne, "some theatrics deserve attention more than others." Mrs. Hawthorne returned the look with polite neutrality, though her mind ticked briskly behind her composed expression. Opaline was the sort of woman who placed her words like chess pieces, elegant, deliberate, and always several moves ahead. June, sensing the tension congealing like cooled gravy, introduced shortbread diplomacy at once. "Mrs. Hawthorne bakes the most marvellous winter shortbread," she announced, lifting the tin. "Lemons, est, rosemary, and a touch of honey. A restorative recipe, she says." "Restorative to conversation, I hope," Sir Edmund murmured, though he smiled faint, tired, and nostalgic. He was a man who had once commanded rooms. Now rooms seemed to command him. After pudding, a spiced fig, and almond tart served with brandy cream, the table dispersed, as though each person wished to retreat into a private orbit of grief, inconvenience, or calculation. Mrs. Hawthorne did not rush to rise. Instead, she remained near the great fireplace, stirring her tea slowly, while the others dissolved toward their respective destinations. The first observation, the fire burned bright, merry, and entirely ordinary, and yet something about it continued to tug at her attention like a thread left untrimmed. The logs crackled at intervals, but when she listened closely, she noticed the rhythm was almost too even not mechanical, but peculiarly patterned, as though the sound were being framed by something else. She glanced at the brickwork. No irregular soot patterns, no fresh mortar, no signs of disturbance at first glance, and yet old houses, particularly grand ones, were experts at hiding their amendments behind ornamentation and age. Not the bricks that speak, she thought, but what they conceal. She had observed this sort of deliberate distraction once before during a village fete some years earlier, when a stolen donation box had been masked by a very loud Morris dance performance. The culprit had counted on spectacle to exhaust scrutiny. Christmas fireplaces were spectacles too. The folio her thoughts turned to the locked leather folio. Mr. Pike had carried a man who never parted from documents unless he wished them to be found. A solicitor's life was paperwork, precision, and discretion. For such a man to collapse abruptly, unattended, while guarding something he called finalized, felt narratively convenient to those who wished for the matter to conclude quickly. Convenient, but not satisfying. "Where is the folio now?" she murmured aloud. The drawing-room maid, Elsie Craddock, who had lingered to polish candlesticks near the sideboard, startled slightly a bright-eyed girl of 20 with sensible shoes, an efficient bun, and an imagination that had clearly spent too much time alone with old chimneys. "Oh, the folio. Ma'am, the constable took it. Wouldn't let anyone touch it after the doctor left. But I saw something odd, ma'am, if you don't mind my saying." "I rarely mind what people say," replied Mrs. Hawthorne. "I mind only what they do not say soon enough. Well, Elsie stepped closer, lowering her voice. Last night, when the family was singing carols, Mr. Pike kept glancing at the fire, not at the flames at the mantel mirror, like he was checking whether someone was behind him." "Behind him? Yes, ma'am, but the mirror only shows the fire. You see, it doesn't reflect the corner where the old study door is. So if someone were standing there, they would not appear in the glass," finished Mrs. Hawthorne gently. Elsie nodded vigorously. "Exactly, ma'am." A new thread pulled taut. "The interviews begin, Mrs." Hawthorne always preferred to begin where tension brewed strongest like tea under the surface. She visited the manor housekeeper first, knowing full well that housekeepers saw everything and forgot nothing, but shared selectively. Mrs. Beatrice Slade received her in the still-room, a warm, herb-scented chamber where copper pots gleamed and jars of preserved damsons and gooseberries sat in tidy rows. Slade herself was brisk, composed, and the sort of woman who could reduce a crisis to logistics without breaking a sweat. "A sad business, but not an impossible one," she said, ladling boiled water over drying mint. "The doctor believes the heart, and the constable believes the doctor." "And what do you believe, Mrs. Slade?" asked Mrs. Hawthorne, seating herself. "That beliefs are luxuries," replied Slade. "I work in certainties, and the certainty is this. The household wishes the matter settled before Christmas Eve. Sir Edmund cannot bear disturbance during the season. Traditions must proceed." "Traditions can be disturbed by murder too," Hawthorne murmured. Slade's ladle paused, then resumed stirring. "If murder were present, it would show cracks. Murder is messy in temperament, even when tidy in method." "Oh, but temperament has tells long before cracks appear," said Hawthorne. Mrs. Slade glanced at her then, with a small smile that did not reach relief. "If you uncover cracks, ma'am, I trust you'll tell me where to polish." The antiquities study next. Jasper Quill, whose enthusiasm for artifacts made him the most likely to notice unusual objects, and the most likely to overlook people while doing so. His study was a wonder: cabinet of curiosities, carved snuff-boxes, Victorian ornaments, cracked porcelain figurines, silver candle, snuffers, and a curious iron poker with a stag's head handle that looked older than most of the house. He was rearranging a collection of miniature chiming bells when she entered. "Mrs. Hawthorne, do come in mind the rug. It's Persian 1920 Zouave, frightfully temperamental." "Temperamental things often are," she replied, sidestepping it neatly. "I wondered whether you noticed anything unusual last night, Mr. Quill." "Unusual? Christmas is a festival of the unusual," he declared. "We sang carols. For example, I'm quite certain the Major was off. Guy, though that may not be the sort of anomaly you mean." "Not off, Guy," she said gently. "Off place." He paused, thinking. Well, the mantel clock struck 13 after midnight. That would certainly qualify. "Oh, not because it malfunctioned," he clarified. "Because the hour was adjusted yesterday. Lady Helena dislikes 12, chimes interrupting carols, so she had me reset the mechanism to a 13. Strike sequence 1 extra toll at midnight to mask the transition. It's all rather clever acoustics. Clever acoustics indeed." "And the pamphlet you mentioned?" she asked. "The 1898 Whispering Hearth one." "Oh yes, archived. But I'll show you later if you like." "I would like," she replied. very much. The family circle, the Sable family solicitor, had been a man who recorded facts. Now Mrs. Hawthorne would record people. In the adjoining parlour she found Major Fenwick warming his hands over a tumbler of whisky, Miss Opaline writing Christmas cards with immaculate script, and Drusilla correcting ribbon loops on a garland as though propriety were an antidote to uncertainty. Fenwick studied her over the rim of his glass. "You're thinking it wasn't the heart, aren't you?" "I'm thinking," she said, "that hearts are excellent scapegoats. They carry blame silently." Opaline's pen did not stop moving. "Scapegoats are useful," she said evenly, "particularly when a family wishes to protect its peace. And peace is useful when someone wishes to protect their secrets." Hawthorne countered gently. Drusilla sniffed. Fenwick raised a brow. Opaline finally looked up. "You're dangerous, Augusta," she said softly, "because you sound so harmless." Mrs. Hawthorne smiled. "Harmless things are often the most overlooked, which makes them rather useful for noticing everything else, wouldn't you say?" Silence answered her, and silence in Sable Manor was now full of footprints. Mrs. Hawthorne returned to the fireplace once more before retiring upstairs. The folio was in police hands. Legends were distractions. Clocks had been altered for acoustics. Mirrors had blind corners, and people checked fires for reflections that could not reveal them. A death ruled natural, a house ruled theatrical, and a Christmas ruled curiously convenient for someone. She paused at the hearth, eyes narrowed slightly. Christmas puzzles, she thought, are rather like family gatherings. Everything appears wrapped in ribbon. One must simply know which bough to pull first. The mystery had begun. The corridors of Sable Manor at night were like the underside of a stage. The scenery remained, but the colour drained away, leaving only structure, shadow, and the faint smell of firewood that never quite surrendered to the cold. The household had retired. Early grief was a respectable excuse, and respectability was the Manor's favoured costume, but Mrs. Augusta Hawthorne suspected exhaustion was not the cause, it was dispersal. When people feared exposure, they instinctively widened the distance between themselves and anyone observant enough to draw lines between them. Upstairs, the guest rooms overlooked the snow-draped estate. Moonlight glimmered across the grounds like sifted sugar, but the beauty did not soften the questions in her mind. She had placed her teacup aside and opened her small pocket notebook, the same that contained knitting measurements, seasonal reminders, and occasional remarks about human peculiarities. It was a harmless-looking object, which made it perfect. The manor clock below struck 13, the muffling midnight chime Jasper Quill had proudly engineered. The extra toll lingered in the air like a false clue, reminding her how carefully the family controlled sound, narrative, and perception. If they managed acoustics this well, she thought, imagine how deftly they might manage a death. A folio and a will. The first twist arrived not through legend, but through law, for while the constable had taken the leather folio into custody, the rumour of its contents had leaked out before luncheon even cooled. A solicitor may record facts, but households recorded consequences. By early afternoon, Dr. Rowan's assistant, young Dr. Callow, arrived in the village on a separate errand, and innocently supplied the spark that set the gossip alight. The folio contained not merely finalized documents, but an amended Sable family will. Not a scandalous notion in itself. Wealthy families amended wills frequently, but the timing was damning. Sir Edmund's estate had been quietly restructured to favour one inheritor overwhelmingly. reducing several others to what Drusilla Carraway would call sentimental tokens rather than inheritances. The doctor did not know which inheritor had benefited, but someone at Sable Manor did, and someone had very much wished Mr. Pike could not deliver those papers safely to Christmas morning. Mrs. Hawthorne did not need the name to sense the temperature shift. A death that looked natural, paired with a will that looked unfair, was the very definition of a hearth hiding its entrance. The second interview, Major Fenwick, she found Major Cyril Fenwick in the Manor's winter garden, a glass-roofed conservatory kept warm by hidden pipes, where Christmas roses bloomed in defiance of the season. The Major was feeding crumbs to a solemn cluster of sparrows, his coat draped over a wrought-iron bench, whisky flask peeking from the pocket like a witness refusing to stay concealed. "You've heard about the folio, I suppose," he said without turning. "I've heard that rumours walk faster than postmen," she replied, settling beside him, "which means someone started them deliberately." He smiled thinly. "You're thinking the death was deliberate too." "I'm thinking," she said, "that Christmas is a poor time for coincidence, and an excellent time for opportunity." Fenwick nodded toward the sparrows. "I've had enough of opportunity. War gave me my share. If someone wanted the will buried, they'd have picked a cleaner season than carols and fireplaces." "Oh, the season was clean," she replied. "The method was clean. Only the motives are muddy, which is why they're trying to be swept before Christmas Eve." He studied her then sharp, considering. "Well, sweep all you like, but look to Quill first. He knows every hidden cavity in this house. He's always poking at walls, hearths, floorboards. A man obsessed with secret compartments is a man who might use one. A neat redirect." "Too neat, perhaps. Thank you, Major," she said. "That is precisely the sort of suggestion someone wishes me to follow." "And will you?" "Oh, no," she said, rising, "but I shall note that you wished me to." He laughed real this time. "Clever old bird you are." She inclined her head. "Not clever, Major, merely familiar with birds who drop crumbs to distract from the seeds they guard." The third interview Jasper Quill, she did, however, interview Jasper Quill, though not for the reason the Major hoped. Quill's study of antiquities meant his answers would contain too much, which was often more revealing than too little. Quill was polishing a Georgian tinder-box when she entered again, humming a fragment of "God Rest Ye Merry, Gentlemen," in surprising tune. "Mr. Quill," she began, "do you believe in ghosts?" "Not particularly," he said cheerfully, "but I believe in atmosphere, which ghosts are marvellous for selling. And murderers," he blinked, "oh, much harder to sell. They ruin atmosphere by requiring evidence. Unless," she said, "the evidence is staged to resemble a legend." Now he paused, the tinder-box still in his hand. "You're referring to the whispering hearth, of course. But legends cannot kill solicitors." "People can," she replied. "And people use legends to hide themselves doing it." He exhaled slowly. "Well, if someone wished to hide something in the hearth, they'd need knowledge of the old priest cavity behind it. But that cavity was sealed when the east wing was renovated in 1947. Solidly bricked. No entrance now, not even a keyhole." She smiled. "Bricks may seal holes, Mr. Quill. They do not seal motive. Still," he added quickly, almost reflexively, "if it were about documents, one might consider Opaline. She benefits from family permanence. She lives for legacy. The rest of us merely visit it." There it was again, the redirect. The family kept pointing fingers in a circle, like dancers trying not to face the audience. The first red herring the poker, the next clue rose not from interviews, but from objects. Mrs. Slade approached her near dusk, carrying the iron stag-handled poker Jasper had mentioned earlier. "Found beside the hearth this morning," Slade said. "Odd place for it. Usually lives in the east corridor rack, and it was warm to the touch when I lifted it." "Warm," Hawthorne echoed. "Not fire. Hot," she clarified. "But held recently, long enough to borrow body heat. A poker that travelled, a hearth that legend claimed concealed priest entrances, a solicitor who watched a mirror blind corner, a folio that contained inheritance consequences, and now a tool that had been moved, held, and intentionally misplaced." Hawthorne accepted the poker, turning it gently. "Thank you, Beatrice. This is not a clue." "Not a clue, no," she said. "It is a prop, which means someone wishes me to examine the fireplace for priest holes, secret cavities, or evidence of intrusion." "And you won't?" "Oh, I will examine it," she replied, "but I will examine the person who placed the prop first, not the direction they hoped it would point." The second red herring the carol sheet that evening, while carol singing resumed in the manor, because tradition must continue even when suspicion did a second red herring fluttered to attention. June Birch found it, wedged inside a hymnal in the entrance hall, a handwritten carol sheet titled, "The Hearth Knows All a Sable Christmas Rhyme." The verses were amateurish but unsettlingly specific, hinting at secrets bricked behind flames, truth sealed in stone, and voices silenced before Christmas bells. It was signed only with initials, J. Q. Jasper Quill protested at once when confronted. "I sign everything J. Q. Jasper Quill, it means nothing." "It means everything," Hawthorne thought quietly, though she said only, "It means someone hoped you would protest exactly that way." Rising stakes by nightfall, the household was prickling like a holly branch shaken too hard. Major Fenwick pointed at Jasper, Jasper pointed at Opaline. Drusilla implied Fenwick Opaline watched them all like a juror, withholding verdict Slade polished certainties, but counted inconsistencies and misses. Hawthorne, the quietest person in the room, was beginning to see the shape of the frame around the fire and the shape of the hand that built it. For in cosy murders stakes were not raised by blood or spectacle, but by the sudden realization that the danger was not past, but present, seated at the table and passing the bread sauce. As the snow thickened again outside, she closed her notebook. Murder, she reflected, is rarely about hatred. Often it is about interruption. The permanent halting of something one fears cannot be allowed to proceed. And Christmas Eve was only 3 nights away. If Sable Manor had been holding its breath before, it now seemed to exhale long, slow, and uneasy. The sort of exhale that comes when a truth is approaching the surface, not crashing upward like a splash, but rising like a bubble through deep water, quiet, inevitable, and impossible to ignore once glimpsed. Mrs. Augusta Hawthorne began her day earlier than the rest of the household. Dawn had not yet declared itself when she descended the back staircase, the servants' route, narrower and colder than the family stair, where the wallpaper thinned and the history of the house felt closest to one's shoulder. She did not take this path to be discreet. She took it because discreet places stored undisguised truths. In the entrance hall, moonlight still paled the rugs. The adjusted clock was silent, resting between its 13-chime theatrics. The fireplace burned low embers rather than flames, the morning's first confession. June Birch joined her shortly, dressing gown swapped for a wool skirt and sensible cardigan, notebook and shortbread tin abandoned now for sharper tools, curiosity and impatience. "You look as though you've reached a conclusion," June said, rubbing her arms against the chill. "I have reached several," replied Mrs. Hawthorne, "but only one that explains the behaviour of the others, and that is, that Mr. Pike did not die of his heart," she said gently. His heart merely stopped at a convenient moment for someone else's plans. June exhaled. "You're certain? Not because of medicine," she replied, turning toward the hearth, "but because of motive, timing, acoustics, and choreography. People lie, clues perform." June blinked. "Choreography? Oh yes," said Hawthorne. "This household has been conducting a careful dance of misdirection since luncheon, and they are not nearly as good at it as they believe." The hearth's real secret. She approached the great fireplace, lifting the iron stag-handled poker, still resting where Slade had placed it the previous evening, no longer warm, but suggestive, like a signpost hoping to appear accidental. Mrs. Hawthorne knelt not to inspect for priest holes as intended, but to run her gloved fingers along the mantel mirror frame above the fire. Carved oak ivy curled along its edges, solid, unremarkable, traditional, except for one small inconsistency, a faint smudge on the right hand underside of the mirror frame barely visible, as though someone had steadied their hand there while leaning forward, a hand wearing something dark, woolen perhaps, or gloved like her own. "It is not the cavity behind the bricks," she murmured, "but the blind corner beside the study door that concerns me. The mirror doesn't show that corner," June said softly, remembering. "Exactly," replied Hawthorne. Which means Mr. Pike was not checking the fire. He was checking whether someone was watching him from a place the mirror would not reveal. June frowned. But why place the poker as a prop at all? "To give us something theatrical to examine," she replied, rising. A suggestion of hidden cavities, priest holes, sealed entrances, anything to keep suspicion architectural rather than personal. "And the Carol sheet signed J. Q." June asked, "A performance too?" She replied. If Jasper wished to divert suspicion to himself, he would have written something far more flamboyant than a rhyme about sealed secrets. No, the initials were placed there because someone knew the family would assume Jasper Quill was eccentric enough to write it, and honest enough to deny it. Loudly, she closed her notebook with a small, decisive click. "The question is not who loves hidden compartments," she said, "but who fears documents being read aloud at Christmas." The motive circle tightens. June's eyes widen. "The will? Oh yes," said Hawthorne. "The will." The folio had contained amended inheritance terms. The family had learned of its presence before dawn, despite the constable confiscating it immediately, which meant one of two things. Someone had already read or copied the documents before the constable arrived. Someone wished others to believe the will was the motive. While hiding a more specific interruption, Fenwick feared the papers, but pointed at walls. Quill loved artifacts, but pointed at people. Drusilla loved control, but pointed at superstition. Opaline watched legacies, permanence, and consequences. Mrs. Hawthorne's mind drifted back to a far smaller observation from Act I. Respectable people panic in sentences. Guilty people panic in structure. And someone had structured this entire mystery like a stage play with altered chimes to mask midnight movement, a blind corner mirror to conceal presence, a warm poker to redirect inquiry, a forged Carol sheet to implicate the loudest protester, a natural death ruling to close investigation early, and above all, a folio of documents meant to be delivered Christmas morning, but interrupted before it could speak the key question: who had access to Mr. Pike before the carols began? She asked aloud. June thought back. He arrived himself, placed the folio down during carols. Housekeeper says no one touched it after that. The Major says Jasper pokes at walls. Jasper says Opaline benefits. Drusilla says nerves belong in bottles, but... Finished Hawthorne softly. No one mentioned who was sitting nearest him while the clock was being adjusted yesterday. June's eyes widened sharply. Opaline reset the clock sequence. She said slowly. Jasper adjusted the chimes, but Opaline handed him the key to the mechanism room. "And keys are always more useful than legends," said Mrs. Hawthorn. The revelation forms Opaline Sable had been calm, unreadable, precise. But calm people could hide motive, unreadable people could hide panic, precise people could hide interruption, and Opaline, above all, had a motive to interrupt the reading of inheritance consequences before Christmas morning made them irreversible. But not for wealth. No, the motive was subtler, because wealth invited attention. Interruption invited silence. Mrs. Hawthorn's final deduction was this: the amended will was not the murder's motive. It was the murder's deadline. Mr. Pike had already known something that morning, something someone feared he might reveal before Christmas bells restored old alliances and severed new ambitions. And only one person in that household feared legacy more than poverty, feared interruption more than ghosts, and feared papers more than war. A young woman who watched mirrors, controlled narratives, managed chimes, and preferred quiet permanence to loud inheritance. Stage set for confrontation, Mrs. Hawthorn straightened her shawl and glanced toward the study door's blind corner, empty now, but full of implication. "The stage is ready," she said softly, "which means it is time to remove the audience." June swallowed. "And the culprit? Oh," she said, turning toward the crackling hearth one last time. "She will reveal herself the moment she realizes the fire was never the witness at all." The snowfall began again that evening, softly at first, then with a steady insistence, as though the season itself wished to blanket the world in fresh simplicity. Snow, Mrs. Hawthorn had always thought, was a natural archivist. It covered untidiness, preserved footprints, and invited one to trace paths that had otherwise vanished. It was a fitting night for resolution. The household assembled once more in the Christmas drawing-room, not by formal request, but by quiet inevitability. Suspicion had drawn them there like iron filings pulled toward a magnet. The fire had been stoked higher now, flames leaping briskly, throwing gold and shadow in equal measure. Stockings swayed faintly on their hooks. The mirror glimmered, blind corner still dutifully blind. The poker had been returned to its rack in the east corridor earlier that day, its job as a prop now complete. Sir Edmund stood near the mantel, hands folded behind him. He looked every inch the country gentleman, yet age had softened his outline, leaving dignity without armour. Lady Helena sat in a high, backed chair, posture immaculate, though her fingers worried at a ribbon loop on her sleeve. Major Fenwick leaned against the sideboard, whisky-glass present, once more not a clue, merely a character note. Jasper Quill hovered near his aunt, face eager, tense, and theatrically pale, though his curiosity was genuine even if his timing was not. The housekeeper, Mrs. Slade, remained standing by the tea service like a woman braced for both answers and instructions, and Miss Opaline Sable, the most composed of them all, sat writing still Christmas cards now complete, envelopes sealed, handwriting perfect. She had the look of someone who believed a story had already ended, not because it was solved, but because she had written the final line herself. Mrs. Hawthorn entered last. She did not require an announcement. Her presence performed that duty without assistance. "I apologize for delaying the festivities." She began gently, but I fear one puzzle remains unsolved before Christmas may properly proceed. Drusilla Carroway sniffed, but it lacked its earlier bite. Even sceptics lost enthusiasm once certainty wavered. June Birch, seated quietly near the window, watched the room sharpen around her godmother. She had the expression of someone who already knew she was witnessing a confrontation, not a ghost story. The final deduction, natural death, was declared rather quickly. Mrs. Hawthorn continued, which is often the way when a household wishes the matter closed before questions grow inconvenient. "Doctor." Rowan, present now by summons from the local constable, seated stiffly in the corner, cleared his throat. "I ruled by symptoms, not convenience, madame." "Oh, I do not fault your symptoms, doctor," she replied. "I fault the timing of their circulation." Silence rippled. Mr. Pike arrived with a locked folio. She said, turning to the family, "A folio containing amended inheritance terms, yet the rumour of those terms reached the village before luncheon. That rumour did not come from the constable. It did not come from you, doctor, and it did not come from Mr. Quill, whose initials were forged onto a carol sheet placed too obviously to be sincere." Jasper blinked indignantly. "Forged? Oh yes," she said kindly. "You adore compartments, Jasper, not deadlines, and the rhyme was written by someone who feared the date on which the folio would speak aloud, not the walls in which it might hide." She turned now toward Opaline, who had finally ceased writing. "Miss Sable," she said softly, "you held the key to the mechanism room yesterday. You supplied it to Jasper Quill, which means you alone possessed access to the clock chamber and knowledge of the mirror's blind corner, where a presence would remain unseen." Opaline met her gaze without trembling, though the room felt suddenly smaller around her. "You accuse boldly, Mrs. Hawthorne," she said evenly. "I accuse not boldly," Hawthorne replied, "but reluctantly. Boldness requires drama, reluctance requires truth." The culprit, revealed the village constable, Constable Graves, rose from his seat, face grim but respectful. He had not interrupted earlier, trusting the sleuth to reach the moment in her own time. "Miss Opaline Sable," he said, "did you read the documents in the folio before Mr. Pike was found this morning?" Opaline exhaled, not with panic, but calculation exhausted at last. "No," she said. "I read them before the carols began last night." Gasps flickered, but politely, like candle flames in a draught. "You see," she continued, standing now, hands folded neatly before her, "wealth was not the matter. It was legacy and reputation. The amended will stripped me not of inheritance, but of influence. Sir Edmund wished to return the estate's stewardship to Major Fenwick, old alliances restored, new ambitions." Silenced, the reading on Christmas morning would have made it public, and once public, the power would shift permanently away from me. Lady Helena's hand rose to her mouth. "But why harm Mr. Pike?" "Because he knew," Opaline replied simply. "He knew I had read the will early. He confronted me by the fire. Not loudly, Pike never wasted volume, but in that quiet voice that left no room for denial. He said he would seal the folio until Christmas morning and tell no one. But a man who notices secrets in others' timing is a man who may notice more later, and I could not risk the possibility that he might." "And so you interrupted him," said Hawthorne softly. "Yes," Opaline answered, with the house's own tools. The method explained, she gestured toward the hearth. "I placed powdered foxglove extract into his bread sauce," she explained. "A tincture kept in the still-room for heart regulation. Ironic, I admit. The Major's injury draught contains it occasionally. It slows the pulse when overtaxed. I knew it would resemble a natural cardiac collapse to any physician not seeking poison. Doctor." Rowan's jaw tightened. "Foxglove arrests the heart in symptoms identical to failure." "Exactly," she said, "which is why I did not fear the doctor's ruling, only his curiosity, and the tapping hearth sound," June whispered, unable to restrain herself. Opaline almost smiled. A small coal, shovel placed behind the grate, expanding as it warmed, tapping faintly against brick. "I tested it earlier. Sound is persuasive when one wishes people to believe the house is talking rather than a person, and Jasper was the perfect performer to blame for strange acoustics." Jasper's eyes widened. "You used me as a red herring." "Not you," Opaline corrected. "Your reputation for peculiarity." Mrs. Hawthorne inclined her head slightly. Guilty people often confuse reputation for evidence, and flamboyance for suspicion. It is why the harmless are so often accused first. Restoring the calm Constable Graves exhaled. Then you confess to administering poison to interrupt the reading of the amended will, knowing the symptoms would resemble natural heart failure. Yes, she said simply. I confess. Lady Helena sagged back in her seat, not fainting, merely collapsing narratively rather than medically. Major Fenwick stared into his glass. Sir Edmund closed his eyes for a long moment, grief settling properly upon him now that its impostor had been exposed. And the folio? Sir Edmund asked quietly. It was locked. Graves replied, but we have opened it. The amended will stands legally valid. It names Major Fenwick as estate steward effective Christmas morning, though stewardship now transfers without ceremony rather than through it. Major Fenwick swallowed. I never wanted it read aloud. I merely wanted the past restored quietly. And that is precisely why you are innocent, Major, said Hawthorne kindly. The guilty require silence with a deadline. The innocent merely require silence itself. Mrs. Slade poured fresh tea mint for nerves, Assam for dignity, exactly 3 minutes steeped, and placed cups before the family without awaiting instruction. Some puzzles ended in arrest, others ended in logistics. The fire crackled, entirely ordinary now, its performance complete. Final scene. June approached Mrs. Hawthorne near the door. You solved it without ever opening the hearth, she said softly. Oh, the hearth was never the witness, replied Hawthorne, pulling on her gloves once more. Only the deadline placed upon it. And Christmas proceeds. Oh yes, she said, smiling faintly, but this year with fewer theatrics, and a great deal more truth. The snow outside continued falling, covering new footprints, preserving old ones, and quietly restoring Everwinter St. Mary to the sort of calm that felt real precisely because it had been earned, not staged, and at Thimble End Cottage a small notebook waited to record the season's final observation. Murder is interruption. Peace is continuation, and truth is the only tradition worth restoring.